Hello, my name is Senta Sanders. I'm joining you from Augsburg, Germany today, and I'm thrilled to be able to participate in this online symposium. The title of my presentation is Performing Precariousness on Thin Ice, Ecomedia and the Arctic Climate Crisis. Contemporary environmental calamities and instances of human rights infringements have additionally underlined the importance of place within the area of post-colonial eco-criticism, bringing about the current concentrations on issues of environmental justice, which unearth and critically examine unequal and unethical distribution of environmental danger and degradation that has been brought about by immoral actions of the so-called progressive world. Within the scope of growing apprehension pertaining to global climate change, creative environmental narratives that are conveyed via the various mediums of film, literary, performative, or visual arts not only enable their audiences to make sense of the world and what it means to be human by significantly deepening their understanding of and connection to the past, present, and future, but also play an essential role in shaping global environmental consciousness by means of exposing acts of environmental injustice that are incessantly being inflicted upon marginalized people and the ecosystems they inhabit around the world, by means of, and I'm quoting De Lowry here, engaging in an ongoing critique of the homogenization of global space from European colonialism to its aftermath in neoliberal globalization, end quote. In doing so, creative narratives enable their audiences to imagine the difficulties of others whose conditions of life differ from their own. The ability to envision the plights of others becomes especially important in view of the fact that the United States missed the chance to redefine itself as an ethical partner of a global community after its own vulnerability was tragically exposed on 9/11. Rather than taking the opportunity to, and I'm quoting Butler here, reflect upon injury and attempt to find out who else suffers from permeable borders, various forms of unexpected violence, dispossession, and fear, end quote, the United States and other neoliberal actors continue to add to the precariousness of some lives at the expense of others, rather than recognizing the ethical dependence that humans have on each other in spite of their national and international borders. While originally applied to contemporary epistemological and ontological discussions of frames of power and being against the backdrop of war, Judith Butler's notion of the precariousness of life not only augments Rob Nixon's concept of slow violence, and vice versa, but is also effectively embodied by it when considered through the lens of global climate change. A central trope of the Anthropocene age, Nixon's concept of slow violence captures the delayed effects of transnational environmental injustices that occur gradually and out of sight, mainly affecting marginalized people and their ecosystems. Nixon emphasizes the utter failure of those not directly affected by the ongoing affliction to acknowledge these seemingly elusive injustices and wonders how the imperceptible environmental calamities of slow violence can be transformed into narratives that are powerful enough to incite public empathy and political intervention. While Butler also points to the ethical necessity of working toward a social transformation for the better, she argues that some lives may not be recognized as lives at all, thus emphasizing our moral obligation to help those who are not fully acknowledged by the dominant sociocultural order to be heard and seen. In what follows, I will draw on both Nixon's and Butler's theoretical approaches in order to argue that Gina Aptemarco's Kivalina, Life in the Modern Arctic, and Zacharias Canucks and Ian Morrow's Quirpionyak, Inuit Knowledge and Climate Change, I hope I pronounced that correctly, are persuasive documentaries that enable their viewers to recognize and empathize with the vulnerable human face of the climate crisis by means of enhancing visualization of slow violence that is transpiring at a fast-forwarded pace in the far north. By means of vividly portraying the dire effects that global warming and toxic carbon-based contaminants have on the lives and lifestyles of marginalized indigenous Arctic communities, they offer their viewers a, and I'm quoting Say here, potential window into the lack of cultural recognition for the most oppressed and disfranchised, end quote, people of the Anthropocene. In the documentary, Kivalina in the Modern Arctic, viewers are introduced to the plight of the vulnerable community of Kivalina, which you can see here, a small Inupiaq village in northwest Arctic Alaska that sits on a rapidly eroding barrier reef island, which is sandwiched between the Chukchi Sea and Kivalina Lagoon, at the mouths of the Wulik and Kivalina rivers. Originally used as a seasonal hunting camp, Kivalina was not intended to become a permanent settlement, yet forcefully became one when the Bureau of Indian Affairs built a school on the island in 1905 and informed people who lived in the geographical area that they had to bring their children to the school to be educated or face imprisonment. More than a century later, the people who were forced to move to this designated place are now experiencing the dire effects of slow violence that are clearly transpiring at a fast-forwarded pace, yet lack significant recognition in spite of the discernible tragedy that their land is literally crumbling into the surrounding bodies of water due to the consequences of global warming. Although the most significant predicament of slow violence undoubtedly lies in its inability to be perceived, since the overstimulation of mass media has left many almost incapable of identifying with violence that fails to act in accordance with Hollywood's fast-paced and spectacular enactments thereof, or various frames of war that are used to celebrate nation-building acts of self-defense. Some of the obstacles regarding the recognition of slow violence may, however, exceed circumstances of temporality, and instead have to do with, quoting Butler here, exclusionary conceptions of who is normatively human, what counts as a livable life, and a grievable death. This seems to be the unfortunate case for the people of Kivalina, whose land was officially designated a disaster area in 2005. Despite the fact that immediate evacuation was recommended by various agencies, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers decided to go against the community's long-standing wish to relocate, and instead elected to build a multi-million-dollar seawall, well aware that the unwanted seawall would not only fail to offer protection from excessive flooding and high waves, but would also, in all likelihood, put an end to the extensively advocated prospect of relocation. Set against the backdrop of said seawall and the omnipresent cranes involved in its construction, Abatemako's serene verite-style documentary picturesquely depicts the people of Kivalina, who go about their everyday lives, drumming, dancing, singing, playing bingo, and preparing and eating their traditional food, all while having to come to terms with the possibility, if not probability, that they have been left behind to, as one villager puts it, welcome the waves, to be taken away to kingdom come. Even though she had initially intended to make a political film, since she could not imagine that the U.S. government would leave the very people they had forcefully settled there more than a century ago in such a vulnerable state, Abatemarco altered the angle of her film, moving from politics to a very personal portrayal of the plight and resilience of the people who had recently lost the lawsuit, Kivalina versus ExxonMobil et al., which the community had filed against 24 fossil fuel companies in conjunction with various environmental justice and indigenous rights organizations, with the objective to not only draw attention to their dire situation and call for action from government and corporate officials that had so far ignored them, but also force those accountable for creating and spreading false discourses concerning global warming to pay for their immoral and misleading actions. The director's poetic depiction of the lives of the people who endeavor to preserve their traditional lifestyle within the realm of their failing landscape makes clear that a political stance is superfluous, as the film's storied observations powerfully assert the senselessness of the seawall that the American government has, against all common sense, imposed upon the people of Kivalina. Hence, the Sisyphean activity of the cranes that seem almost melancholic in their sluggishness as they pick up piles of rock only to put them back down at an adjacent spot seconds later is a performance of purported purpose that is echoed by a futile meeting between the community and U.S. government officials, during which the latter resignedly take note of the community's hardships and concerns while evading questions concerning the price of the unwanted seawall. claiming that they lack the authority to answer. These pointless acts reach an epitome when one of the community members points out that the recurring meetings between the community and US government officials would be just as effective if one of them were recorded and replayed at future meetings, as they are merely hollow repetitions. Furthermore, the documentary illustrates that by first forcing the people of Kivalina to move to the thin barrier island, which now merely measures a quarter mile across at its widest point, and then leaving them to fend for themselves without providing even the most rudimentary means of escape, such as an adequate amount of evacuation boats, the United States government has triply discounted one of its very own communities, I'm quoting Nixon here, as political agents, as long-term casualties of slow violence, and as cultures possessing cultural and environmental practices of their own, end quote. Additionally, they have affected the dehumanization of the people of Kivalina by means of collectively robbing them of their essential human rights to life and security of person, as defined by Article 3 of the Universal Declaration of the Human Rights of Man. Further rights that are violated are the right to the preservation of health, the right to life, physical integrity and security, the right to their own means of subsistence, and their rights to residence and movement and inviolability of the home, as outlined in the Regional Human Rights Document, the American Declaration of the Rights and Duties of Man. Even though they inhabit a different region of the circumpolar Arctic than the people of Kivalina, the Inuit of Nunavut also live precarious lives, given that they must also come to terms with the harsh reality of fast-forwarded slow violence that is threatening their lives and lifestyles. The world's first Inuktitut documentary on climate change, Quirpinnaq, Inuit Knowledge and Climate Change, by Zacharias Canuck and Ian Morrow, makes it possible for viewers all over the world to imaginatively set foot on Nunavut land and learn about storied Inuit knowledge of the past and present. Knowledge that ultimately enables the global audience to intellectually and emotionally follow Nunavut elders from the Arivat, Igloolik, Pangnirtung, and Resolute Bay communities, as they juxtapose their collective storied knowledge and traditional lifestyles with the harsh reality of the warming Arctic. By means of not only conveying that their traditional way of life and belonging are endangered, but also illustrating the inextricable link that exists between the global and the local, the documentary succeeds at ascribing place, time, and humanity to the rapidly transpiring, albeit still largely ignored instances of slow violence. In doing so, it illustrates that established borders can neither alter the human condition of, and I'm quoting Butler here, fundamental dependency on anomalous others, end quote, nor the interconnection to one's environment, as the prominent Inuit leader, Mary Simon, points out by briefly juxtaposing European American sense of self, which celebrates individuality and blindly believes to exist independently from its environment, with Indigenous sense of self that is closely connected to the landscape, people, and stories of its respective culture. Both recent scientific findings and the accounts of the Inuit elders in the documentary attest that the complex connection between the Inuit people and their land is undergoing calamitous changes that are occurring twofold within the region of Nunavut. On the one hand, people are at risk of losing their land to erosion caused by the thawing of permafrost, while on the other hand, the food they are consuming is being contaminated by northbound persistent organic pollutants. In the documentary, QIKCC, elders from various Nunavut communities voice their experience in regard to these twofold environmental threats. Accordingly, several Pangnirtung elders share an alarming experience with viewers when they relate the unprecedented event of the flooding of the Duval River, which occurred on the 8th of June in 2008 and caused 2 bridges to be washed away and parts of the riverbank to collapse, causing local inhabitants to fear for their land and livelihood. Moreover, they voice their concerns regarding the contamination of their food, yet maintain that they just can't stop eating it, as doing so would contest their traditional lifestyle. Even though they might not have to leave their land per se, as the people of Kivalina will most likely have to at some point in the relatively near future, In the course of time, both the contamination of their food and the erosion of their land will undoubtedly lead to what Rob Nixon has termed displacement without moving, which occurs when one's native place loses its life-sustaining attributes. It is indisputable that industrial activities of modern-day humans, such as the burning of fossil fuel and dispersing of toxic carbon-based contaminants, which initially become trapped in the cold Arctic air, yet ultimately end up within the bodies of the Arctic animals and those who depend on them for subsistence, are destroying the land and lifestyle of the Inuit people. This fact confirms the growing conviction, and I'm quoting Barilla here, that current environmental practices are a contemporary form of cultural genocide. Not only are people becoming ill from exposure to polluting chemicals, but the contamination and erosion of land and melting of the Arctic ice are also harming traditional subsistence practices that are central to their native culture." End quote. In view of the fact that the contemporary environmental practices of the global world are resulting in the cultural genocide of the Inuit of Nunavut and various other indigenous populations, these practices, or more fittingly malpractices, must be seen as immediate infringements of human rights. This is precisely why the QI-KCC contributor, Inuit leader and activist Sheila Watt-Cloutier, and other Inuit filed an appeal with the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights in December 2005, claiming that the climate policy of the United States is violating fundamental human rights of the Inuit, such as their right to enjoy the benefits of their culture and the right to use and enjoy lands they have traditionally occupied, among others. By exposing the devastating impacts that contemporary civilization's oppressive actions have on indigenous cultures, who attempt to preserve and live according to their traditional lifestyles, the people of Kivalina and Nunavut among them, these documentaries establish that the ongoing environmental procedures of the globalized world pose a direct threat to the life and lifestyle of the inhabitants of the circumpolar Arctic. Despite the fact that they can neither turn back the clocks of time nor mend the damage that is rapidly transpiring within the realms of the traditional lifestyle and inhabited space of Kivalina and Nunavut, both documentaries make significant contributions to the humanization of issues concerning Arctic climate change by means of operating as powerful mediums to visualize the victims of slow violence that occurs in an accelerated or fast-forwarded pace. Moreover, by establishing the global interconnectedness that exists between the Arctic region and the rest of the world, they directly involve their audiences in the issues that are being portrayed on screen, which in turn compels them to, and I'm quoting Barilla here, to reflect on their own relationship to the land and the communities affected by these issues. End quote. The fact that dire scientific findings regarding climate change have reached an unsurpassed level of alarm and urgency, yet continue to be met with political inaction, confirms that current practices of confronting the climate crisis have largely remained unsuccessful. It also underlines the urgent need for effective environmental narratives that possess the potential to bring visibility and recognition to otherwise unseen people and places. By providing the appalling, albeit ongoing tragic story of Arctic climate change with human protagonists and their narratives, both documentaries succeed at, and I'm quoting Nixon here, giving imaginative definition and human perspective to the issues at stake while enhancing the public visibility of the cause. End quote. Creative narratives such as Kivalina, Life in the Modern Arctic, and QI-KCC are imperative as they effectively infiltrate the inner landscapes of their audience's imaginations, where they generate empathy and understanding for those worlds away. The American writer Joan Didion once wrote that we tell ourselves stories in order to live. In the circumpolar Arctic, stories have been and continue to be told in order to survive. We are now finally starting to understand our connection to and our role in these stories. Thank you very much. I look forward to your feedback and your questions.